Good evening. My name is Peter Desmond. I'm one of the organisers of Fairer World Linfield, and welcome to Great Big Green Week. And this evening we have a talk and discussion about climate justice and the global south. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this call, and also to our two speakers, Billy Anderson, who is part of the campaigns and advocacy team at Tearfund, and Sarah Newnham, who worked for many years in Tearfund's international team, seeing the impact of climate change on the people that Tearfund support. And the session this evening will be a talk by Billy and a short quiz. So I think the talk by Billy and Sarah, a short quiz. Billy will interview Sarah and then we'll have an open discussion. So I will also start sharing. Over to you, Billy, and you tell me when to share the screen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's really great to be part of your Linfield Green Week because there's so many different events. And also, you know, it's great that you've put this event or some of the events online so that so many people can join. And as we've already heard, people coming from other countries as well. As Chris said, I work at Tearfund. We are an international development organisation working to tackle poverty in around 50 countries of the world. I'm in the global advocacy team, as Peter said as well, and that means we tend to focus on the root causes of poverty, and climate change is one of those root causes. It's causing people to be pushed into poverty. So we do what we can to advocate or bring change on those root causes. And for me, love for my global neighbours, because I work at Tearfund and I'm concerned about my global neighbours living in poverty. That is one of the big motivations for why I work on climate change. And throughout the evening, you'll find out just a bit more about how climate change is impacting our global neighbours. But before we get on to that, I would love to hear what motivates you to be here tonight. So I just thought perhaps we could start with a moment of reflection. So if we can have the next slide, Peter, and each think about, well, what got me caring about climate change? Is it that I love nature? Perhaps I'm worried for future generations. Maybe it's even David Attenborough, who knows? Whatever it is, bring that to mind. And then if you're willing to share it, type it in the chat, because it would be great for us all to see why we care about climate change. So you can possibly take the slide down, Peter, so that people will now be able to see what goes up in the chat. I think it's easier to see the chat when there's no slides up. So yes, if you're willing, stick a sentence in or a word and say why it is you're here tonight or why you care about climate change. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Africa. We will certainly touch on that, and it sounds as though you've got some experience there, maybe. Yeah, caring for the whole world, the impact on people who least cause the problem. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that, Peter. Yeah, Sarah says seeing people who are suffering on the other side of the world, and we will actually hear from Sarah, who has seen this firsthand a bit later. Anyone else want to add anything? I know it's a bit tricky trying to type into the chat, but it's just good to know a little bit about what motivates people to care about climate change and to give up an evening or to come out. I know you haven't had to come out exactly, you are sitting at home, I expect, but to put the time in to think about this a little bit more deeply. Great. Anybody else want to? Climate change is something we should all care about as it affects everyone. Yes, that's true. You read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the 1970s, and you've been trying to do your bit ever since, James. Oh, that's brilliant. Yes, sometimes it can be a book or a film or something that you see or that you take in, and it suddenly opens your eyes to it, doesn't it? Great. Okay, well, can I have my next slide then, Peter, please? I guess some of you will have seen some of these headlines in the summer. following the IPCC report in August. And I'm imagining that most of you who are here tonight probably don't need to be told that climate change is serious because you're willing to, come to an event like this. But I think perhaps people in our richer countries are beginning to wake up to this fact. Code Red for Humanity, we had all the headlines about wildfires and floods, even in countries that were quite close to us, and in London, in fact, flooding. So we're waking up to this fact, perhaps, in richer countries, but actually people living in poverty around the world have already known this for some time. They have been very aware. So what are we going to do this evening? Well, we're going to start off by listening to some of their voices and stories so that we can actually hear a bit from people who are at the sharp end of climate change. We'll hear how climate change is affecting them, but we'll also hear some of the stuff that they are doing to try and tackle and adapt to climate change themselves. And then finally, we'll also talk about what we as British citizens can do about climate change and to take climate action. So we will end on a sort of hopeful and active note, but there will be a little bit of hearing some of those tough stories as well, which I think it sounds as though some of you are already aware of. So let's start by hearing from my colleague Norman in Honduras. So I'm going to share my screen in just a moment, because this is actually us listening in on a Zoom call that happened between my colleague Norman and my colleague Jack. Now, Jack's not on the call, but Jack's realised as he was listening to Norman talking a little bit about the impacts of climate change, wow, this is really powerful stuff. I would love to be able to share it with others. So he said to Norman, can I just record this call? And we're not going to play you the whole call, because you would be like, oh, this is a bit long, Jack and Norman having a conversation. But we've cut it down and we've added a few little clips of the things that Norman's talking about, just to give you just a sort of an insight into another Tearfund staff member who's just talking about this is how climate change is. So let's listen in on this call. I'm going to share my screen.
My name is Norman Molina. I'm from Honduras, Central America. The effects of climate change are huge. The strongest evidence is that levels of poverty are rising. Honduras, Central America, almost 60% of our population is living in poverty. Migration waves of people trying to move up north, especially to find livelihoods, make a living, because mostly of climate change. Fishing communities, they had their small restaurant, they cook the fish and they sell fish for a living. These communities don't exist anymore because the water levels have increased in ways that have made entire communities disappear. Rain has become a threat. Our hearts start pumping very fast and our minds start creating stories, and we're traumatized by it. Every time I hear rain, there is this fear of what's going to happen, which is sad, because rain in the Bible for us, rain it's a sign of blessing, of life, of crops and growth. And sadly, because of the damage and the vulnerability that we have in our countries, rain has become a threat. So last year, we had 2 hurricanes that caused huge damage, especially in the north coast of Honduras. 2 hurricanes in 1 week in between, not even in my wildest dream. I never imagined having that. More than 4 million people affected by these 2 hurricanes, more than 100,000 people in shelters. It's funny that climate change, for example, it's not one of the things that we contribute the most in the region, like Central America especially. However, we are the ones that are affected the most. Central America is one of the most, if not the most affected or most vulnerable area to climate change. We are brothers and sisters in all this. We belong to a global community. What you decide to do and the decision that the powerful people decide to make has an effect on us. And if these decisions are positive, it will be good for us. But if we continue this pattern of exploitation and destruction and going beyond the limits of the planet, maybe you will not feel it, but we will feel it.
Sorry, I'm struggling to stop sharing the screen. Oh, there we are. Find the little button. Sorry about that. Such a professional. I find that quite sobering, even watching it, and I've watched it 5 or 6 times. And it's partly because I suppose when you know someone, you're a little bit more connected. But actually, I find it really hard to hear Norman say that when it rains, the fear comes into his heart. And it really helped me to understand how just ordinary people in Honduras are being impacted by climate change, that they're fearful even when it's just raining. And so whatever your reasons were for caring about climate change at the beginning of this session, and I know many of you it is because you have empathy for people around the world, I hope that sort of hearing Norman's words makes you sort of think, oh, actually people like us are being impacted by climate change just because they happen to live in a certain part of the world, you know, and we are less impacted because we're on a temperate island. Yeah, so it's hard to hear, but I think we all need to hear it and realise that our global neighbours are being affected badly by climate change already. And strikingly, as Norman said, sometimes it's the people who have done less to contribute to climate change who are being more affected. And I think, Peter, you said that in one of your reason that you typed in the chat. So it's a justice issue as well. It's unfair that the people who have done less to contribute to climate change are being more affected by it. We're going to move to a little quiz now, so we're going to lighten it up a little bit. And I'm going to bring some stats and some numbers, because some people need stats and numbers to actually really help them take these things in. So don't worry, no one will know what your answers are. You don't have to put your hand up or tell us your answer. You're just going to put your answer in your head, and then I will give you the correct answer and you'll know whether you got it correct. So no fear here, but it's hopefully it will give you a couple of interesting stats which will help you understand this. So the first question then, the poorest 3.5 billion people in the world, so that's half the world's population, are responsible for what percentage of emissions would you think? What does X equal? Is it 10%, 15, 25, or 35%? Of course, if it was fairly divvied up, it would be 50%, because this is 50% of the world's population. But we already know from what Norman said that the poorer people are creating less of the emissions, less of the problem of climate change. So get your own number fixed in your head. Everyone done that, hopefully. If you answered 10%, you are correct. So well done those people who answered 10%. The poorest half of the world are only actually creating 10% of the emissions. So I hope you can begin to see how unfair that is. Okay, we'll have a look at the next question. We've only got 3 questions. Don't worry, this is not a long quiz. This is a little question just to sort of, let's think about how much of the energy that we use is renewable or non-renewable. So we're going to look at the non-renewables. Of all the energy used in the world, what percentage do you think comes from the non-renewables? That's natural gas, coal, or oil, and oil. So is it 57%, 72%, or 82%? So fix your answer in your mind or scribble it down on a bit of paper if that's the way you work. If you answered 82%, you were correct. So you can see there is still a long way to go before we stop causing so many emissions that cause climate change. We've got to move to more renewables. Okay, final question. And this one's got 3 parts to it. So in the UK, the average person emits 5.65 metric tons of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. You don't really need to remember that number. But what we do want to do is compare. So how many people from Honduras, let's take that first country, would it take to emit the same as 1 Brit on average? So have a think. You know it's going to be more than 1, because Norman has already told us that Hondurans don't emit as much as the richer countries. So pluck a number from the air. I know it's guesswork, but this is just to give you a bit of an idea. If you said 5 Hondurans, you would be correct. So it's almost like a whole family of Hondurans emits the same as just 1 of us, 1 British person. Sorry, I don't have the facts for Canada, Heather. So, but you can look them up afterwards. I can give you the link. Let's try Afghans. So Afghanistan, we know much in the news. It's a country full of conflict. It's a country both Sarah and I have been to multiple times. How many Afghans do you think it would take to emit the same or to use the same amount of carbon up as one British person? Think of a number. And if you said 20, you would be correct. 20 Afghans, so that's almost 2 football teams, isn't it? Compared to one British person emitting the same amount of carbon emissions. Right, let's move to Africa then. Burundi. How many people from Burundi would it take to emit the same amount of carbon as one Brit? Think of a number. If your number was 140, you would be correct. So as you can see, people in Burundi are really living in poverty. They are hardly using any of the world's resources. And actually, we want them to use a bit more of the world's resources. They're not having a fair share at all, and they are living very poor lives. So Desmond Tutu has actually said the most devastating effects of climate change are visited on the poor, those with no involvement in creating the problem. It is a deep injustice. And really, people in Burundi and Afghanistan, they are not creating the problem of climate change. They are not causing the emissions that have caused climate change. Those of us who have been part of creating the problem and who live in countries that are creating the problem, we need to be more of the solution. So don't feel just like a heavy weight on you and just, oh, this is terrible. Think, right, this galvanizes me to want to do something about it, particularly because I come from a richer country. Okay. We're going to now have the delight of talking to Sarah. So Sarah Newnham is from Linfield, and she also used to work for Tearfund, so I know her well, which is great. And in Sarah's role, she got much more to travel and see the front lines of where climate change was really causing problems. So Sarah, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you were doing and tell us a bit about what you saw?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm Sarah Newnham, as Billy said. So until last year, I worked for Tearfund. I worked for them for about 15 years. So I've traveled across most continents, I think, with them, working across many countries. I used to work with Norman as well. I finished with them last year, but still obviously an avid supporter. So often talking about them and just talking about the work that they do and about the kinds of issues that I saw. So I thought I'd start by just sharing some stories today of a few places that I've been to. Not just to tell you about the issues that there are, but also to share some of the ways that people can adapt to climate change and why therefore it's really important that we actually support people in countries to be able to cope with climate change. So, of course, as we heard Norman say, that many of these people are not necessarily the causes of climate change, and they've spent generations. Many of them are subsistence farmers, so they depend heavily on the land. And they've done many things through generations. They've passed knowledge down to their children, but now they're finding that the kinds of things that they used to do are just not working, or they're really suffering because of the impact of climate change causing disasters in the areas that they live. And so what Tearfund and many other agencies have sought to do is to try to help people to have both the money and the knowledge to be able to change their way of life, and be able to sort of continue to live and make money from the area that they are living in. Peter, if we can go to my first slide, please. Thank you. So I thought I'd take you first on our virtual aeroplane to Pakistan. So Pakistan is a country that I have lived and worked in and visited many times. And I'm going to ask you to cast your minds back to 2010. Now, that may feel a while ago, but the reason I take you then is because there was a significant amount of flooding and it hit the headlines in the UK for quite some time. Some of you may have a little twinkling in the back of your mind about that. And why was that? It was because the flooding was absolutely extensive that year. So there's a huge river that comes down from the Himalayas called the Indus River, and it goes through India and Pakistan. And year on year, with changes in rainfall, but also an increased ice melt from the Himalayas, is all contributing to making the water that comes down the Indus River just get bigger and bigger. And this particular area of Pakistan is the last in the river rush. So if other countries have sort of adapted to trying to run the river in different directions, it then still all ends up in these areas in Sindh in Pakistan, which is one of the poorest areas in the south of Pakistan. And so just to say a little bit about these pictures, I mean, this picture of this family, and forgive me because I forget their names, but it was just absolutely devastating to see them. I mean, could you imagine having to make that decision to wade through that water with your children when they're up to it, the river to their necks, just to evacuate from your home? And these people don't have the privilege of swimming lessons, so it's such a humongous risk to evacuate your children from their homes. And you'll see that the other picture there is then where many people ended up, is putting tents just perched on little bits of land where the flooding sort of hadn't reached. And so I remember visiting back in 2010 and just seeing the utter devastation. Next slide, please, Peter. Thanks. And so you'll see on the left-hand one, just some of the devastation of the rising waters just wiped out huge amounts of crops. So that's people's food for the year gone. And I've put the other picture in a little bit flippantly because it is a picture of me, but the reason I put it in is, yes, that is a giant wok that I had to sit in order to be taken. But I make a serious point from this is how I had to get to some of the villages. They were completely cut off, and somebody would kind of wade through the river water, kind of with the women or the children or whatever in this wok, taking them across in order to get access to the village and to be able to come out of the village. And, you know, while it was something that I kind of rack up as quite an experience for myself and a story to be told, but actually that is something that people had to do day in and day out until the floodwaters subsided. And so you can just really get the kind of real impact of what people had to go through. Next slide, please, Peter. So, of course, you know, Tearfund and other agencies gave humanitarian aid, as you would expect in these circumstances. And I'm not going to go into details of that today. But what I do go into is, at the same time as giving food and water and all the emergency kind of items that people need to satisfy their needs, we would also take time with communities and work with volunteers to be able to train them up to work out how they could prepare for flooding in the future. And in fact, since 2010, flooding has been a kind of virtually year-on-year event in this particular area of Pakistan. It's not been, thankfully, as bad as 2010, but it's still happening. So one of the things that we do is work with community volunteers to draw up a problem tree, and you can see the lovely picture there, where they're analysing what some of the problems are and what some of the potential solutions are. And that helps communities to be able to think about for themselves, what resources do they have, what kind of things could they potentially do. And then Tearfund and partners have then started to support those communities to think about what sort of things they could put in place. So just to give you an idea about what some of those things were. So once the river water has subsided, there is just trying to desilt part of the river. So obviously with pollution and kind of soil erosion, you get more and more going into the river, and so the need to just keep cleaning that out. But of course, that's quite a hefty job. You need big machinery, so that needs to be done on a regular basis. equipping people for good evacuation, provision of some boats and some first aid kits, training people up to use the first aid kits, and also working out how you might evacuate people. So that might be things like identifying where are vulnerable people within the communities and how do we evacuate them, and raising up. So people use water pumps that are centrally located in the village to collect their water. It would be about raising some of those up so people go up steps and access the water so that they're still able to access clean drinking water from those pumps, even when there's some rainwater on the ground and some flood water. And also building some shelters. So that sort of gives you an idea of some of the immediate types of things that we're able to do to help people face the reality that flooding is going to happen year on year, and so how we can help them to adapt to that. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to take you across the border, and if you travel through Sindh, you start to get to what's called the Thar Desert, and the Thar Desert goes into India, and the other side it's the province of Rajasthan, which is the Thar Desert. And so it's amazing to think that you have this immense flooding, and really just kind of across the border is then this desert area, sort of sitting side by side. And I visited this a few years ago in Rajasthan, and I think it was the hottest, driest, most intense experience I've ever had. It was well over 40 degrees the day that I went. The soil is really literally like sand, and you just can't believe that anything grows there and that people actually live there. I mean, I saw people out working and I could barely stay outside for more than a minute. It was such intense heat. And year on year, this area hasn't had rain. It suffers the other problem. It just has immense drought. And so, of course, that has lots of implications: shortage of drinking water, crops are failing to be as productive as they have done. And many of those crops also feed goats. So you can see the goats in the picture, and camels. The camels are often used to help in the tilling for crop production. And the goats are obviously for a source of meat and milk. But with decreasing plants, then the animals aren't able to eat either. And so you know, you don't just lose your crops, but you lose your animals as well. And that's now meant that tilling land has then become more expensive, as they can't use camels, they have to use tractors. It all has knock-on effects gradually. When I went to Rajasthan, I think one of the things that I struggled with the most was meeting a family, Mr. and Mrs. Asalam. And I heard one of the saddest stories that I think I've ever heard, really, as I've traveled around. And this was the story about, so because people are struggling to make a living off the land, they've had to resort to other ways of making income. And there are stone mines located in that area. So many people, or many men in particular, are forced really to go and work down the stone mines. Now, many people will have heard, of course, of slavery. You may also have heard of bonded labor. And these men are very much in bonded labor. So just to explain what that is it's really people taking full advantage of people. So they're being paid, but they know that those people have no option but to work there. And therefore they are given really pitiful sort of health and safety measures. They're given very little money because they know that they have no other option. So they're just really abusing them. And because there's no health and safety measures, many of the men are breathing in the dust that's in the air. And so they suffer a medical condition called silicosis, which can be fatal in their lungs. And so Mr. Asalam, when I met him, he was really struggling to breathe because of this silicosis. But he had no other alternative but to keep working in the mines. One of the things that Tearfund was doing, therefore, in this area was to create what are called self-help groups. I won't go into too much details of those, but they are sort of savings and loans groups, often women, and they save a little bit of money collectively, and then month by month a different woman takes a loan out in order to start a new business and pays the money back. They've worked really successfully in many countries in Asia, and India's no exception. And so the great news is that Mrs. Arsalam did take out a small loan, and she was able to start just a little grocery shop in the area selling oil and matches and shampoo, many of the just basics that people needed every day. And her husband would go and travel to a nearby town to be able to buy stuff in bulk, which was much cheaper, and then of course be able to sell it in the shop. And the great news was that eventually, after about 6 months, he was able to stop working in the mines, because they'd actually paid back the loan and were able to make enough to be able to live on it. So it's fantastic to be able to kind of hear his story and hear that there is something that is able to be done to help people. But all of that because, you know, the drought that is being suffered in this area. What other kind of things can be done? Peter, if you could just move on to the next slide. So there's a couple of things that you can do within the land itself. So one is rainwater harvesting cisterns. So these are quite common in many countries now. If you've traveled at all, you may have come across these. They're sort of big tanks that are embedded in the ground where the rainwater is able to run in. It's almost like us having our own water butts. It's the same kind of principle. It just collects up the water, and so it just means that every bit of rainwater isn't wasted and they're able to use it. Next slide, please. And then the next thing is rainwater buns. So this was a practice that communities used to do many years ago, but gradually over the years they'd somehow forgotten or stopped using it. But it's creating kind of earth walls around your field. It stops rainwater from running off, and it means more rainwater sort of running into your field. Therefore, the crop yield is better. And it also stops sort of wind and rain blowing off all of the kind of good soil on the top. So there's just simple things that can be produced that can help communities. But the great thing as well is just being able to support the communities to also talk with the local government to get them to put funds in, so that they're not reliant on organisations like Tearfund to come and help them with it and give them the funding, but that they can also ask the government to give them the support. And so it's always really good to be able to equip communities to be able to do that. And it was really good to hear that the government had actually given them 6 more rainwater tanks in this area, you know, so that they were able to capture more and more rainwater, which was great news. And finally, I'm going to whisk you across now on our plane to Malawi in Africa. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the impact of sort of environmental degradation that has been suffered there. So year on year, Malawi has suffered a mixture of drought and flooding. It happens pretty much every year, and it's intensified because of climate change. Again, many people in Malawi rely on farming for their livelihoods. And so I was really pleased to be able to meet this lady that's on the right, Mrs. Patani. She's a mother of 6. She lives in a village called Nyanya, which is in Malomba district in the south of Malawi. And next slide, please. And again, she was part of a sort of savings and loans scheme. And she was able to start a small store. Now, because one of the challenges is when people can't rely on farming anymore. What they really need to do is what we call diversifying livelihoods. It just means having multiple jobs. It just means they don't have to risk everything in one thing and rely completely on the weather. They can spread their risk and try different things and try to get an income. So that's sort of the kind of thing that we were trying to do with Mrs. Patani, and she started a small store as well, similar to the example that we just heard in India. So again, a little grocery store. She was also able to buy a bicycle and pay her kids school fees and things like that, which was fantastic. And she's actually now able to hire some other people to be able to work on her land as well. So she's able to help other people. So these kinds of assistants don't help just one person, they have an effect on a number of people in the village. And so not just helping her to have multiple options, so she's not just relying on her crops, but also helping her in terms of how she actually works on her crops. So Tearfund provided some conservation farming training, which would help her to think about new techniques. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, many people have farmed in the same way and the same sorts of crops for many years, but these kinds of things will be affected with the change in weather patterns. And in Malawi, for example, they're very reliant on maize. It's one of their primary crops, but maize is very vulnerable to varying weather conditions. So it's helping people to think about what else they might grow and to get access to those kinds of seeds. So she was able to start growing some cassava and sweet potatoes and work out how to cook them, and eventually she found that the kids were enjoying them and they weren't having to be as reliant on maize. And then the final thing is what you see, sorry, stay on that slide, Peter, is what you see on that slide, which is fuel efficient stoves. So in Malawi, many poor people don't have access to any kind of stoves or other kinds of fuel apart from firewood. And they used to just make open fires. And so it's quite an inefficient way of creating enough heat to be able to cook your food. And so one of the things that we introduced were these fuel efficient stoves. You can see in the pictures, so they're made of clay, which is available in Malawi. The soil is quite a heavy clay content. And so you can make them and you can kiln them in a oven. And then you can use them and you just break up the firewood and you put it inside the stove. You can see a range of different types there. But the advantage of that is that what used to be used in 1 month now takes 3 months. And of course, the problem with having to use so much firewood is that vast swathes of the forests in Malawi were becoming completely deforested. And so this is a way of being able to help people to cheaply be able to reduce the amount of firewood they're using. And of course, along with this, you would want to encourage tree planting schemes to be able to renew much of the firewood that they're taking as well. But the great thing about this is not just teaching people how to make the stoves, but then introducing it as a way to make a living as well. So Mrs. Patani, for example, is able to make stoves and then sell them. So not only are other people able to benefit from using them and you therefore use less firewood, but also she's able to make an income from them. And so that's something that Tearfund's been doing is introducing sort of stove making kits to a number of families as well. So that's just a few little examples of places that I've visited and people that I've spoken to and how they've been affected by climate change, but also some of the ways that they're able to adapt to it. I just wanted to finish very briefly. Peter, if you can go to the next slide. This is a bit overwhelming, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the main point just to make is that, so Kofi Annan, who used to be the UN Secretary General, said we can't stop natural calamities, but we can basically understand and equip people better. And, you know, we see many things like floods and droughts and hurricanes. These are all increased by climate change, but also so are people's vulnerabilities to them. An increase in disease, a destruction of people's livelihoods, people become more vulnerable. And therefore, you know, there are big disasters because of both the hazard that's increasing because of climate change, but also because of the vulnerability. And so this is the challenge for many agencies like Tearfund, is how can we not just respond to the disasters with humanitarian aid, but also how can we increase that adaptation that people can do so that they're able to live and continue to work and make a living. Yeah, thank you very much. I will leave it there. And
thank you so much, Sarah. That's really, really helpful to. And if you have questions for Sarah, do keep them in mind, because we will have time for Q&A at the end. But yeah, I think that's painted a really good picture of, well, the wide-ranging impacts from drought to flooding to crops not growing so well because of the changing weather patterns, and also just of the vulnerability that people face when you are living on a knife edge of poverty and you really are relying on your next crop being successful, or one of those climate impacts coming through and ruining your crop obviously can completely, you know, knock you off kilter. And there's no insurance systems, of course, in many of these countries. It's not like you can just say, oh, my house got flooded, I'll get it replaced. No. So yeah, that's really helpful. It really helps us to understand how climate change is impacting the poorest people, but also what they are doing and what organisations like Tearfund are working within communities to help people adapt to the changing weather patterns and to help them mitigate the impacts of climate change. But we also, of course, want to actually start tackling that root cause of climate change itself and making sure that we don't let climate change spiral out of control and get worse. And so we now come back, I think, a little bit back to us, the people in the richer countries, who are probably contributing the most to keeping, you know, to emissions and therefore making climate change happen. We've overconsumed in the richer countries, and we've given back more than our fair share of polluting emissions. And this is where we need to actually start saying, how can we tackle climate change and stop it from getting any worse? So what are we going to do in the UK and Canada and any other countries that have joined the call since we started and fall into that category of richer countries? As I am guessing most of you know, this year is a crucial year, and particularly for us in the UK, because we are hosting the UN climate talks, otherwise known as COP26. We have this amazing opportunity and also responsibility to push our governments, and particularly we're thinking about our UK government, but yes, please, Heather, push that Canadian government to, as they come to the COP, to really step up and take strong climate action and really push for as much ambition as possible, because the decisions that they make in November in Glasgow are actually going to affect us now and for generations to come. So we have to show them that there is a vast movement of people calling for climate action and saying that if you don't do it, you're going to, you know, end up losing your jobs. It will be unpopular with your voters and with your electorate. So what can you, the average person, do to get involved? We've got a few suggestions. This is just a small snapshot. There are so many things that you could do, and I'm sure we'll have some suggestions later from folks if we have a bit of time for conversation. The first one I've put down is speak up. So use your voice. We're fortunate in this country that we are actually allowed to speak up politically. We can speak to our politicians. We have those opportunities. And around the COP, we particularly want to put the pressure on leaders so that they feel that this will be a vote winner for them if they actually, you know, take climate action seriously. So one thing you can do is you can sign petitions, and I'm sure you're probably all part of different organisations that are active on climate change. The Great Big Green Week, which Linfield Green Week is a part of, is sort of overall organised by the Climate Coalition. And the Climate Coalition have they called it a declaration. It is really a petition to Boris Johnson, which we would love you to sign. I think Peter's just put, or Chris has just put the link in the chat. Many organisations are using this as their petition this year. Tearfund is, but I know other organisations like RSPB or all sorts of organisations across the UK are supporting this. And the hand-in to Boris Johnson is in about a month's time. So we would love you to sign that petition if you haven't already. You can click on the link, or I guess Chris might send it round to you if you are already in touch with Chris. So do sign that, and do sign other petitions. It will give those organisations an opportunity to get a foot in the door with the person that they are targeted towards. Another thing you can do that's a little bit more, obviously signing a petition is very easy, and so I hope everybody on this call will do that, is you could join the 6th of November Day of Action. So, and that's a way of speaking up, but with your whole body, putting your whole body, going on a march. The climate talks are 2 weeks long, and the middle weekend of the COP, there is going to be marches all around the world. And we want the UK ones, of course, to be big because we are the hosts this time. So the Glasgow March will be big, the London March will be big. I think for Lindfield, I think your nearest might be Brighton, or you could go to London, or you could do a Lindfield March. You know, if you want to organise something in Lindfield, you can get it added to the COP26 coalition map. So there's a map of events there, and they do have events around the world. So there may even be something in Canada on that map. I don't know, Chris, if you can post that link in the chat as well for people to have a look at. But yes, do join one of those marches, make your own placards. You can say what you want on your placard. That can be a way of speaking up. Or you can send off for a Tearfund placard if you'd like a Tearfund placard to take there. So speak up, use your voice in many, that's just 2 ways that you can do it, but there are many ways to do so. Live differently. Living differently, we know that we in the richer world, we are contributing to the problem of climate change too much. And so we need to make some changes to reduce our carbon emissions. Now, this is not a thing for beating yourself with a stick and sort of feeling guilty and all of that. No, use it as a positive thing and say, right, what can I do? And start making some of those changes. There are so many small things that you can do, but that make a big difference. So switching your energy provider to a green one, for example, would be a great thing to do and an easy thing to do. Cutting the amount of meat you eat. I know that Chris and Peter had a vegan cooking demonstration yesterday. Great thing to do. Start talking to your friends and family about these things and work out what you could do. Challenge yourselves, but don't beat yourselves up about it, because this needs to not look like a really miserable activity. Otherwise, your friends and family are not going to want to get involved with it, are they? So try and make it a bit of fun as well. See it as being part of the solution to climate change. It's also part of influencing as well, because actually, as you start to change your lifestyle habits and your consuming habits, you'll find that people will notice, and it's not just your friends and family who will notice, but actually businesses will notice. The more people who ask for a green tariff from their energy provider, the more investment there will be in wind and solar, as the energy companies realise that this is actually a business opportunity. I mean, you only have to look at the supermarkets and how they have started to reduce their packaging and shout out about it and say, oh, look, paper bags here and things like that. Realise that they know that consumers are now asking for less plastic, especially less single-use plastic. And it's the same with the green tariffs. That the government's watching this as well. And of course, if they know that, oh, people want green energy, then they will start to put more investment in renewables. So live differently because it helps you live with integrity, of course, yourself, and know that you are being less of the problem, but also it's an influencing thing as well. And it influences your peers and your family as well. Okay. Get involved locally. Well, Lindfield folks, you have an easy thing, don't you? Because you can easily get involved with Fairer World Lindfield. And I think Peter might say a little bit about this. And also, I think Peter's going to talk a bit about engaging policy makers. So I'll pass over to Peter now.
Yeah, thank you, Billy. Yes, so pure self-publicity, Fairer World Lindfield, I think people know about us. But there are other local climate groups that we're doing different things in different places and in neighbouring villages. So Ardingly Cookfield, our neighbours, also a little bit further away, HKD Transition, Hurst Pierpoint, Hassocks, Kemah and Ditchling. There's a lot, Sustainable Henfield, they're the immediate ones, and there's quite an active group in Horsham with Carry Court and Sussex Green Living. So yeah, lots of things that you can do if you want to get more involved. Engaging with policymakers, yeah, reflecting on my involvement in this process, there are different levels that we can engage policymakers. And on the call this evening, we have Linda Grace from Linfield Parish Council. So we are working with them on various initiatives in the village. Also, Janice Henwood, who is a town councillor with Burgess Hill Town Council, also deputy mayor, and she's also on Mid Sussex District Council. So there's the parish, town, and district levels, and then the fourth level is with our MP Mims Davis. So there are different levels we can work at, and FWL Linfield organised some training by Hope for the Future, who help individuals and groups learn how best to lobby policymakers. And at the end of the day, it's all about a relationship. So there are various things that you can do, and it's sort of an increasing degree of proximity to a relationship. So you can tick a box on an email campaign or a website, which is pretty anonymous, to be honest. It doesn't really take a lot, but policymakers do take it into account when they see the number of people who've replied. You could also write a direct email. You could also type a letter. You could write a letter. Chris is very good at handwriting letters and putting them in the post, which tend to have more impact these days because that doesn't happen very often. On top of that, you could engage with your MP in person or online in one of their surgeries. You could join a march that Tearfund maybe organised, or another of the campaigning groups. So my experience of this with those different levels of policymakers, I think the things that we've done together with people seem to be the thing that makes a difference, because by working together on a particular subject, you get to know people and develop a relationship. And my engagement with, certainly with Mims Davis RMP in Mid Sussex, is on one particular thing, and that's on we don't have yet a roadmap towards net zero 2050. And I am no longer the only person asking for this. Businesses are asking for it as well. It did occur to me that actually I haven't talked to Mims at all about climate justice and developing countries in the global south. If I did, one thing she might say is that she'd be very pleased that Boris Johnson, the UK government, have stopped investing in fossil fuel projects overseas, which is actually something that Tearfund, in their lobbying work with other climate groups and international development organisations, help to achieve. So I think my next challenge, and we're seeing Mims hopefully the Cockairs Farm visit on Saturday, how that might actually work, how I would engage her in this particular issue. What can the UK government do? Well, not reduce overseas aid to from 1.7%. Some really hard conversations and difficult things to achieve, but I think you've got to start. And in the times that we've spoken to Mims, she recognises what we're doing, she acknowledges it. I'm not sure it's going to change her voting habits, but I think some of these things are for the longer term. So that's just some reflections I had, Billy.
Yeah,
So,
thanks, Peter. I mean, I think it's really important to say that many politicians, they say, oh, well, I don't hear enough from my constituents about climate change, or, those sort of issues. And the more they hear, the more they will take notice, because they don't want to be, they don't want to lose the next election. If they think there's a big enough groundswell of opinion in their constituency, then they'll start to take action. There are obviously some who idealistically already care about these things, even if their constituents don't. But for most people, most of our politicians and MPs, they need to be told by a good number of their constituency before they will really start to think, oh, this is something I need to take a bit more seriously. So yes, very, very important. We need those decision makers, and that's businesses as well. So where you can contact businesses and say, what are your green policies, or I don't like the amount of single-use plastic packaging you're using, that sort of thing. It does make a difference if we get enough people doing it. So the more we can then talk to others, whether it's our friends, our neighbours, our churches, our, various other groups that you're linked to, scouts, brownies, whoever it is, get those people mobilised to take action. And the more people we have all calling for this is what we need, is a movement of people. And we're part of that. And it's great to have you guys here online tonight, but we've each got spheres of influence ourselves, haven't we? Our workplaces, our schools, our friends. I know one of my neighbours came to me and I bumped into him in the street a little while ago, and he said, "Oh, we're joining your club." And I was thinking, I wonder what club he's talking about. I don't know what he means. And I was sort of like, "Oh, what club is that then?" And he said, "We're getting solar panels." And we had never spoken to them about solar panels. We've never tried to sort of evangelize on behalf of solar. And yet, what you do, as well as what you say, does make a difference. So sometimes you just live it, but other times you might need to, go and talk to people. So, right. So there are so many ways that we can get involved. We've covered just a tiny smattering of them there. Whatever you do, do something. Don't be paralysed by the enormity of the climate crisis and by, it is devastating when you hear some of the stories about how people's lives are impacted, and yet those people are picking themselves up and they are adapting to living with the effects of climate change. But we really need to actually try and tackle the root causes of climate change, reduce emissions, as Peter was just saying, reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're using, that sort of thing. So yes, let's as part of the countries, as citizens from the countries that have helped cause this, some ways unknowingly, many years ago, people didn't realise just all the damage they were doing. Now we know. Let's be part of the solution as well, the citizens of these richer countries. So we are going to open up for some discussion and questions. If you've got questions, we'd love you to type them in the chat. I can see Mark's added an interesting, devastating review of the risks associated with climate change. It's a Chatham House review headed up by John Major. Yes, that could be a very useful tool for a Conservative MP. It is definitely, Mark, worth thinking, what will my Conservative MP be interested in? Will they be interested in something that's very left-wing and sounds like, it's left-wing? No, they won't. But if you can talk their language, where you can talk about green jobs, where you can talk about talk about Margaret Thatcher. She was very, very switched on about climate change all that time ago. So you might want to even quote her. So yes, thank you, Mark, for sharing that. That's really helpful. And being part of groups like this, where you can actually share things that you pick up, useful articles, things like that, really helpful.
And I think that's what I'd like to mention, Billy, is useful things that we can read. And I think it's all about conversations with people, as we've talked about before, and being informed ourselves and looking at, reading things that we wouldn't normally, come across. And so just a couple of books here I'd like to recommend. One's called Climate Justice by Mary Robinson, who's the former president of Ireland. And what she does is she meets and interviews people from all over the world, particularly in very small indigenous communities, and we hear their stories. So, that's certainly something worth reading. And a very new book out only in the last couple of months is by Jeremy Williams, called Climate Change is Racist. And Tearfund had him come and speak the other month, and he's a fascinating writer. It's a great book, and Farewell Linford have got him coming to speak on November the 18th, Thursday, November the 18th, about that subject. So, and it's about storytelling. I came across a link today called Earth Justice, and it's about, I don't know if you've heard of that, Billy, and it's about people who are in the front line to do with climate justice. So it's hearing their stories. So yeah, the more information we have, the more, we can put this towards the people who can make a difference, perhaps.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of ways to pick up that information. If you're not a big book reader, then I'm sure there's some, short talks that you can watch, that sort of thing. the one thing I would say is don't ever feel, oh goodness, I'm not enough of an expert, because it is a massive subject.
Yeah. Oh, is it?
Actually, you can go to your MP and say, I care about this because, and you know, those motivation things we were talking about at the beginning. If my motivation, and I'll often go to my MP and I'll say, I am not an expert because I'm not a policy expert at all. But I care about this because I know that the poorest people around the world are so impacted, and I can tell you some stories of those. And also my husband's a beekeeper, and I can tell you the stories of how we see the changing climate, even in this country, and how it affects beekeeping and our gardening. And I said, this is, you know, so I can say those things for why I care about it. And you're my MP, and I've got this report from Tearfund, and I trust that they have some experts, or I've got this report from whichever organisation, whether it's Chatham House or whatever. It's good to have those reports from the experts to give your MP and say, look, these people have done the research. I'm not an expert, but I'm actually passing this to you because actually I think they might have something to say. And it can be when there's an organisation that's got, you know, a policy ask as such, you can say, well, could you write to the minister? Could you raise this as a question or whatever it is? So but you don't have to be an expert. So I would like to just like let people know who are thinking, oh goodness, I don't know if I've got time to do all this research and read all these books. Do it if you can, great. But if you don't think you can still be part of speaking up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're coming towards the end of our time here. Are there any final questions or comments?
Yes, has anyone got any questions? We'd love to have any questions from folks.
I actually should have stopped recording.
Oh yes, of course. I forgot you were going to